In this discussion, Ashley Frawley and I talk about the nature of the woke phenomenon. Ashley is a Marxist academic. My views are more liberal and social democratic, although I've been a Marxist in the past, and I certainly learned a lot from reading Marxist literature. One thing we both agree with is that the woke movement isn't in any way Marxist, even though wokies often describe themselves as communists or Marxists. To complicate things further, many conservatives agree with this proposition that woke is a Marxist. As a Marxist, Ashley takes particular exception to the idea that the woke intersectional left is in any way Marxist when its views are so much at odds with Marxist ideas about class. My own belief is that wokeism most closely resembles early fascism, and in my book Porn Panic I actually referred to the movement as left fascism because at the time the term woke hadn't become popular and there was no easy way to refer to this movement. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I hope that Ashley will return to discuss some of these issues in more detail at some point. Okay, Ashley, hey, how are you doing?
I'm all right, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Nice to meet you. And yeah, it's been first, I've actually known of you for a long time, but it's good to finally chat. I'll kind of, you're actually an important part of my personal story, which I'll come to in a minute. But what I wanted to do is just kind of outline what we're going to talk about today, and so it's a fairly free format discussion. But I think our discussion today is on a subject which I think is very important, and as well as that personal for both of us in different ways, which is a discussion of wokeness, the nature of wokeness, and to what extent. By the way, I'm not sure whether to use wokeness or wokeism. So yeah, we'll set some terminology. But yes, let's call it wokeness. To what extent it resembles fascism or possibly other movements, what labels we could put on it. So just to see, I'm a liberal, you call it evil centrist these days, stroke kind of social democrat in my views. I'm an ex-Marxist. I still carry a lot of Marxist type ideas. You define yourself as a Marxist, and but I think one thing we'll agree on is that comparisons between wokeness and communism are probably wider than mark. I don't think it's communism, and I don't think you'd agree it is either.
No, and it's embarrassing as well when they try to use that label because it's a slander. And when people say, "Oh, this is culturally Marxist," it's, I've wasted a lot of click-clacking on the computer on social media trying to explain why it has nothing to do with Marxism, and how ironically that's like this rehashing of like a Jewish plot from quite a long time ago. But anyways.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not only do they refer to themselves as communists or socialists, but then conservatives also agree and they call them communists and socialists as well. So there's this kind of plot to agree that that the wokies are communists, and basically they're not. There's some serious differences between them and communism, which is kind of why we're discussing to an extent how fascism differs from communism and how they might be similar to fascism. So yeah, if we start by introducing ourselves and how and why we got here. Do you want to go first and explain who you are?
Sure. So my name is Ashley Frawley. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at Swansea University. My research mainly looks at emergent social issues, and in particular social problems that are framed as problems of emotion, and how that's become increasingly a powerful way of making sense of the world and communicating social issues. It seems like we have a lot of difficulty understanding why something is bad, except through the language of health or mental health. And I find that very interesting, and how those became very paramount values, and what values have sort of receded. Why do I always mix up those words? Receded in their place. Have receded, like freedom, for example, is not really a value that people cherish any longer. And yet it was at the heart of emancipatory movements in the past. So that's something that I'm interested in. I'm basically interested in how we communicate social problems in an era of no alternative to capitalism, when forward-looking movements beyond capitalism have died. and we're all sort of floundering about trying to make sense of the world. So that's what I do, what I'm interested in.
Okay. Yeah, you're not the only person mixing out words. I actually tweeted a bit earlier that I meant to say bossa nova because I was listening to music, and I said ossobuco, which is an Italian veal dish. So but yeah, I think basically 6 months of being locked down with children has left me with reduced brain capacity.
Honestly, seriously, it's like a worm in my head. It's terrible. Anyway, go on.
So basically, if we talk crap, then people should be forgiven, at least today. And why are you so interested in this issue of wokeness and maybe standing up against wokeness and so on, and defining what it is?
Well, I came to Marxism and communism via the route of universalism, and really questioning the idea of race and biological race theories. My undergraduate degree was in sociology and anthropology. I definitely graduated really, really woke, which is weird. But I also, I think it was my third or fourth year, in Canada, our degrees are 4 years. So in my last year, I came across, ideas about the social construction of race. And I read Ken Malick's The Meaning of Race, which was one of my all-time favorite books, still is one of my all-time favorite books. And I was just really struck by the fact that I'd never heard that before. I'd never really heard about this sort of, this idea that, race plays such an important role, at least our social categories of race play such an important role in society. You start to take them for granted as sort of biological phenomena, and the idea that they had a history and that these categories emerge at a particular time to justify the failures of capitalism, and of liberalism. So the answer to the question, why do we not have equality, fraternity, and so on, all these wonderful ideals that we cherish, or that triumphed over feudalism? Well, they're a lie, right? Look out into the world. We don't have equality, we have inequality. We don't have fraternity, we have war. Well, why is that? And the answer was, we're different, human difference, that some people are just weak, and some races in particular are just weaker and closer to nature, and some are closer to God, and all that sort of thing. So I was really interested in that sort of thing, and that's how I came across Marxism and communism and universalism and all that stuff. So I find it extremely worrying and disheartening to see people turning away from that and moving toward the reification of of race, where it becomes this. I see this rehashing of older ideas, but just sort of inverted in a lot of ways. So this idea that you have this one race of people who are just defunct and irredeemable and really less than human in a lot of ways. And you sort of project all the problems in the world onto them. Well, that's, we've seen that before. And yet that movement is it's called anti-fascist, and it's just so weird. So this is why I've become so interested in it. But in the main, it's because it is so antithetical to everything that I hold dear as a Marxist and a communist, and yet it gets smeared as Marxist and communist. So that's why I'm interested in it. I think it's one of the worst things that could have possibly happened to working class movements, to the left, and I think and its whole part of its whole mission, unspoken mission, completely unconscious mission, seems to be to destroy any sort of progressive movements once and for all. Maybe I'm overstating it, but the degree to which it's going through institutions and the power that it has, it's every day I get an email all about this stuff from my job, and I have this coercion to go along with it. It's so powerful, and so that's why I become interested in it. However, I am also reluctant to make big claims about it, because I like to study things that I could criticize. So before I criticize something, I like to kind of just spend a little bit of time, actually a good deal of time, at least 3 or 4 months of close analysis of exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And usually what it is not what I thought it was, or there's a difference between what I wanted it to be, because it was easier to criticize, and what it really was. So I haven't done that. And so I recognize, just as a bit of a disclaimer, that perhaps the things that I draw out of wokeness are not what their core, what its core really is. And I suppose that there's probably a PhD student out there trying to figure out exactly what it is and how it's expressed and so on, but I've not done that. So that's my sort of disclaimer. I'm sort of reacting to what I see as its most prominent things and just the way that it's infiltrated daily life.
And it may be that this discussion is a kind of knee-jerk reaction. Both of us have this deep desire to pin fascism and wokeness together, and that might not be fair. But yeah, I mean, it's my own background is I come from like 40 years of activism. I think I went on my first anti-racism march about 1979 as a teenager, when the anti-racism movement was really big, and the National Front at the time was a white working class movement, white nationalist movement, and it seemed like a big threat, and it was. People were being chased by gangs and beaten up in the street. So that was racism at its almost at its nastiest, not quite at its nastiest, but it was. It drove a lot of people to get involved. And I'm from a Jewish family. I was at a school at the time where I think I was one of 4 white kids in a class of 36. So 3/4 of the school were black, mostly West Indian immigrants, the children of West Indian immigrants. And so I got thrown into this world of racial politics and anti-racism. And so I marched against racism. I marched against police violence because it was a real thing. And my kids at school their big brothers and uncles were experiencing police violence for real. So that kind of thing motivates you to march against that. And at the same time, there was apartheid, the anti-apartheid struggle, which was again a very real struggle against a totalitarian regime. So yeah, I kind of began woke, if you want to use the term really broadly. I was very much an anti-racist. I was very much I was on the left. I joined a Marxist group. I read Marx and so on. I had that attitude towards that police were an evil representative of the state, and that racism and police violence were kind of inherent to what the police stood for, which I don't necessarily believe anymore. But so yeah, I came from that position where I was, I can play the woker than thou card, because I've been on more anti-racist marches than anyone, and at the time I also married an Indian girl in the 80s. We had a child, so I was also living in a mixed family. I was living in a working class area, and I kind of went into that with an attitude that there's racism everywhere. My kind of left-wing attitude, there's racism everywhere, and I'm going to have to protect my wife and son from racists. And it turned out that wasn't really the case. We on the left tended to exaggerate the prevalence of racism. It became not just a bad thing that we had to fight, it became central to our belief system. And I think that's got worse and worse and worse as racism itself has kind of improved over the years. And but yeah, I went into tech. I started a tech company. I ended up working for porn companies, which was kind of interesting and fun. But via that, I also got involved in politics of sexual freedom. I learned a lot about feminism and different branches of feminism. And I became a sexual freedom campaigner, being a kind of eternal activist. And that kind of hit the birth of the woke era for me was about 2011, when I kind of reached a point where I suddenly realized that the left was just not anything I recognized or anything I wanted to be associated with. And I felt that incredibly personally, because this wasn't just a movement gone rogue. This was my movement gone rogue. And I sought to understand what was going on. And so similar to you, I had values of universalism, the idea that regardless of differences, equality is number one, and that you address any issues that you address them across race lines, across gender lines. You don't make them about race and gender, so whether the issue is poverty or violence or whatever it happens to be.
To a certain extent, I would say that you do have to recognize I mean, like, you can't just treat everybody the same. I do recognize that there's like, you can't have even the whole slogan in the, at mid-century, black and white unite, kind of was
Yeah,
meaningless
that
when
was
Black
that was
people didn't
our
have,
era.
yeah, but it was kind of less meaningful for Black people because they didn't have the same kind of civil rights, even just like liberal freedoms. They didn't even have those. So how can we push for something beyond liberal freedoms, or to, well, not even, okay, I mean, like, civic sort of rights, that kind of thing. When you have that kind of inequality, I can recognize that there's definitely a need to do something there. So when I say universalism, I mean the recognition that at heart everybody has the same kind of capacities, with the exception of obviously like disabilities and so on. But all human beings have a basic kind of capacity for reason and so on. That's what I mean. That there's
Yeah, I
nothing like
mean,
specific to particular groups that makes them fundamentally different. It means that we will never be able to come to terms, or like see things from the same point of view. I think that's the thing that really bothers me, this idea that there's something inherent to particular groups that makes it impossible for us ever to see eye to eye. That's what troubles me, because then there's just
yeah,
no
and it's,
possible
I mean,
movement.
that there was, black and white unite and fight was what was at kind of my generation's slogan against the National Front. But it
Mm.
was, first, I mean, for a start, the British story and the American story when it comes to race are actually very different, so you can't kind of shoehorn them into the same narrative. But it was a very specific slogan because it was black and white, unite and fight, smash the National Front. So it was
Mm.
a call for unity for this
Yeah.
purpose. And but yeah, in addition, yeah, this deep belief in equality that we kind of inherited from the 60s generation, which, as you say, it was kind of fundamental. You couldn't be a progressive and not believe in equal rights. And to me, part of the stuff that started to get me upset about the woke was that they set out to dismantle equal rights, and that the woke part of what the woke movement has been doing has been specifically arguing against equal rights. And you have to me that was a gateway to segregationism, and you actually have overt segregationism creeping into the movement.
Yeah.
So so the left, as I say, the left was kind of against the very things that I stood for. But yeah, I mean, I decided to try and document and write a book about what I was seeing happening in feminism and what I was seeing happening in race, in the racial discourse. And I ended up writing Porn Panic, which is, which was originally began about, it was a book about censorship, and it ended up being a book about this new woke movement. And what fascinates me now looking back is that there was no, sorry, this movement was so new and hard to define that we were kind of swimming in this fog of, we didn't even have the right words. So at the time I decided to use the term left fascism to refer to this new identity movement. And now I would refer to it as wokeness. But so yeah, that's kind of brings us to our discussion, because I kind of, fascism isn't necessarily a good word to use because everyone uses it to
Yeah.
attack everyone else. But I felt it was an accurate way to talk about this movement, and I tried to justify it in the book. And I guess that's what this discussion is today. Kind of, is this movement fascist, or in what ways does it resemble fascism?
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame because the word fascist gets thrown around so much that when you need it, you can't really use it.
Yeah,
But that's why it's important to do a proper analysis and to make sense of what a movement is, rather than kind of just say, oh, that's the same thing, happening again. It's, or like you take small little aspects of it. So when people throw around the word fascism today, it's funny because there's so much stuff written in the late 60s that is so darn similar to what's happening now. Like, it's weird. I need
yeah,
to look into this a little bit more. But I was reading the intro to Trotsky's sort of collected works on fascism, and it was like written in 1969, and it's like today the word fascism gets thrown around. Anybody who's on the right that you don't like is a fascist, and I was like, damn. Like,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not, and it was happening also even at the very, very emergence of actual fascism. There was this idea of like social fascism. So like social democrats were actually just social
Yeah,
fascists. And
which was what the communists called the centrists, what we call the centrists, basically. So the communists tried to argue that centrists were on the side of the fascists, and therefore to defeat fascism, you had to defeat both liberalism and fascism.
yeah, I think you can see that being rehashed at the moment as well, which is not good, because I think it makes more sense, instead of trying to come up with a definition, it makes more sense to think about how these particular ideas emerge perhaps as a reaction to things, certain political causes or cultural change, or things like that, but also in terms of like a dialogue. I don't say dialectic. The word dialectic reminds me of Dianetics. It like scares people away. But this kind of like dialogue between a sort of forward movement in society and a backward pull.
Yeah.
And I think there's always there's this tension always within capitalism, where capitalism has a very powerful progressive side, but it also has a very powerful regressive side, and these two things sort of fight it out. So if you and that's in everything. For example, you can see that in the profit rate. So capitalism has this progressive side of like creating like enormous amounts of wealth and so on, but then it also has a regressive side where it destroys that. And these two things, this trying to overcome that backward pull, pushes it forward, but also eventually will sort of, these things will come together in some sort of explosive, well, not will, they do come together in these sort of explosive moments, and war,
I see these
kind of thing.
this push pull. If you divide society as the kind of the conservative half and the progressive half of society, it seems almost innate to human societies, because to an extent this is what happened to the Islamic Empire, which was incredibly progressive and then regressed and became very backward and collapsed. It's what happened to China to an extent, where China was the world's leading economic power and then became incredibly centralized and conservative and collapsed and allowed Europe to kind of take over. And the dark
I mean, some people even say the dialectic is intrinsic even to nature.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to think that way. I'm quite I'm my background's science, and I do tend to think in that way. I think any group of people is going to divide into the
I mean, like literally like natural processes. Like even like tectonic plate movement, I've seen people use that as an analogy. Like the mountains are created by this sort of dialectic of anyways, but or like the movement, or like time itself is dialectical, this negation of the present, of the coming together of past and future. So you could say that it's kind of everywhere.
But I think it certainly exists in human societies, and I've become much more interested in that lately, because I think you and I'm older than you, obviously, but I've never lived through an era of regression, really. I was born in the 60s. My parents were kind of in the hippie era. I was of the punk era. The general belief was that young people are always going to be more rebellious and anti-traditional than old people. So suddenly hitting a generation that's more, in some ways, authoritarian and traditional than the previous generation, that's quite freaky, just from a personal perspective. That's never happened before. So you do look back to, everyone goes straight to the 1930s to start with, but there are loads of other historical eras you could equate to, and none of them are very promising.
But so I think of, rather than like sort of labeling it fascism, it may be more useful to look at it as this dialectic between a progressive movement and a regressive. So this march into an uncertain and terrifying future
Yeah,
against this desire to go back to something more comfortable,
I
something
like it.
cozy.
So yeah, I like to label myself as a march into an uncertain and terrifying futurist, and you can understand.
Me too, as a proper Marxist.
And yeah, as a Marxist or ex-Marxist, as a liberal, as a technologist, you know, I just think that, well, I can't see any other way than forward, whether you like it or not. But certainly, you know, to me, the future has always held great promise. And, you know, I remember
Well, I mean, it could be anything. Sorry, go on.
yeah, oh, just kind of, I guess it's growing up with the space race. And, you know, we all were expecting flying cars when I was a kid, and, you know, but also just watching the genuine explosion of AI and, you know, computing technology and gene technology and stuff. You know, it's, to me, this is all really exciting, even though it could go, it could be really terrible. And I guess that you're either of the tendency that, say, gene technology could cure all known diseases and feed mankind, or it could lead to cyborgs that eat us all or something, you know. And I'm with the kind of, yeah, either of those could happen, but I still really like the promise of this technology, and I think it should be allowed to develop. So yeah, it's that innate conservative versus progressive thing. So yeah, so I
Yeah,
mean,
well, I
to
mean, it
nail,
could be either of those things because we don't exist in direct relationship with those technologies, right? So if we, you know, we have the technology to do all kinds of things, but are we don't pursue those ends in an unmediated way. We pursue them through the medium of profit. So if something is profitable, it will happen. If it's not profitable, it won't happen. Or it might happen within like a charitable kind of context or something like that. But like the goal was, so what happened when we sort of lost the idea of humanism, of this idea that human beings can be rational and so on, which I think is at the heart of Marxism, because Marx says that we're living in prehistory, this mediated relationship with our ends, the fact that we don't yet pursue what we want directly means that we're still in prehistory of human society. And he says we should make history in the full light of reason. Until we are able to do that, we don't exist in that direct relationship. We're not even fully human yet. We've not fully understood our capacity as gods. It's the end point of the dialectic, right? So like man created God in his own image. Sorry, God created man in his own image. And then we go, oh no, man created God in his own image. And then the next step is man is God. Like we projected it was us all along, right? But we didn't have the material base to actually be gods and to create directly, to create life, whatever, all of these things that we projected onto God. But since we've lost that idea, like to say that man is God, it's like, oh God, like blasphemy. Even like leftists would say, oh, that's blasphemy, that's hubris, and so on. We've lost that, right? So the fact that means that we've given up on the idea that we could take hold of those technologies and harness them to human ends. Yeah. And that makes it more likely that we will create that awful future, because we are afraid to actually come to terms with the fact that whatever the future becomes is up to us. And we have to figure out a way. We have to figure out a way to pursue our ends directly, to move beyond this particular system and to move into a situation where human beings can actually create the world that we want to create in a direct way.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of that. Again, that optimist versus pessimist, or, you know, regressive.
That's
divide.
that push and pull, and that progressive force against the regressive force.
And one thing I mourn is the loss of that optimism from the left. So, you know, I see, you know, climate change is a big, serious, scary, potentially massively destructive thing. But I can see we have the technologies to fix it. The question is whether we can marshal our resources globally to go ahead and fix it. But you have the environmentalist movement becoming increasingly conservative and saying, well, none of this happened 500 years ago. Why don't we go back there? And part of the answer is the human population was like whatever 1% of what it is today. So, you know, to an extent, going back is inevitably going to be inevitably going to wipe many humans off the earth
Yeah,
and so
without
on.
that kind of, that again, that's the result of this loss of humanism, right? This loss of the idea of the liberal subject, that the capacity of human beings to directly, to the goal to exist in a direct relationship with the world, to be able to act on the world, to use the technologies, to marshal our technologies to actually fix this. That's gone. Like without that understanding that that was the goal, without that as the purpose, it became just about like yelling at individuals to change their
Mm.
behavior. And because it wasn't, there was something more powerful pushing people's behaviors, i.e. capitalism, and the need to keep doing these particular things within this system. Without an understanding of that framework, it became, well, people are just stupid, like you're just so dumb, and it's just, we give up on human
Yeah.
beings. And then it doesn't matter if we kill off a whole bunch of them, because we have an idea that we're just like a
Yeah.
plague on the planet and parasites. So again, it's
Yeah.
that
There's a very,
backward pull is affected by the loss of that forward push.
yeah, and this belief that either animals are better than humans or traditional societies are better than modern societies and so on is all
Mm-hmm.
part of this. We're the problem, and it's probably better if we weren't here. But I mean, back
I
to the
mean,
kind of how
in
you,
lots of ways, like earlier societies did have things a little bit better in lots of ways, and in lots of ways
mm,
they didn't. I mean, it appeared as though this is Marx, obviously, from the Grundrisse, but it appears as though human beings were more fully worked out, that we were fully human in primitive communism, because we had not yet fully worked out our social relationships. Like, think about how incredibly embedded we are in society right now. Like, I have
mm,
absolutely no idea how this technology works, but
yeah,
it is through like so many people working together on these every tiny little thing that makes
yeah,
this communication possible and allows for a completely different understanding of and a completely different expression of what it means to be human. So what Marx says in the Grundrisse is, it is as ridiculous to long for that original fullness as it is to imagine with this complete emptiness all history has come to a standstill. So it's,
mm,
in some ways, it's understandable that people would look back to a past because it's comfortable, we've been there, it appears as though things were harmonious and so on, and you kind of have a blinkered, kind of rosy romantic view of the past, because the future and the present appear so empty, so
and unknown.
terrifying.
The future's unknown,
Yeah.
which is the
And
scariest bit
also,
of
I
it.
mean, look what happened when, apparently, look what happened when human beings tried to take hold of history. I mean, the 20th century really had an
Yeah,
impact on all of our movements. Like, it was the Holocaust,
yeah,
you know? And so, unfortunately, that's the lesson that we took, that if when human beings try to take the reins and rationally direct the future, it all goes to shit. Oh, I'm
yeah.
sorry, I shouldn't have sworn. I'm going to
It's
cause you
okay. This
problems
is
with
my
YouTube.
my. I know my YouTube channel allows swearing. Yeah, I think shit's okay on YouTube. I hope. but
Yeah. Anyways.
but yeah, I guess one of the things that makes Marxism so appealing, or made it so appealing in its proper form, is that it has this idea of a cycle. So you don't have to go back. You're going from primitive communism to actual communism to utopian, communism, whatever.
Mm.
So maybe that's why it kind of appeals to both. It could appeal to both the conservative and regressive viewpoints, which is the idea that all of this is a building blocks to going back to how we used to have it, except better, because now we'll have medicine and laws
Yeah.
and stuff like that.
Antibiotics.
Yeah, which is quite a nice. I think it's quite a nice framing. So you don't have to go back to mud huts and things, but we can have modern cities where people which are like villages, and where people cycle and walk and know their neighbors, and
Mm.
basically have all of the benefits of the old ways, and but combined with the new ways.
Mm.
Yeah, I was just going to go back and try and define fascism a bit, because yeah, I think the discussion we've had is part of the problem I hit, which is if you call anything backwards, anything regressive fascism, then you're kind of devaluing the word. So I tried to
Mm.
nail it a bit more. In Porn Panic, I defined it first primarily that it's illiberal in every way, or
Yes.
actually,
It's a reaction against a particular kind of forward movement. So it's not just anything that looks back. It's
yeah,
like it's like the pushback against liberalism and liberal enlightenment. Sorry, go on.
yeah. Oh, no, that's exactly it. So I started with, and I was talking a lot about sexual freedom, and I was talking specifically in my book about the censorship of pornography, which I used as a, a more a specific case of censorship versus free expression and so on. But it's, yeah, so I kind of defined it initially as, so it's, if liberalism is for free speech and liberty, so fascism is definitely against those things. Liberalism is for equal rights, and fascism therefore is going to attack those. Anything fascist is going to attack equal rights. And the kind of third part is reason, or a love of science. A love of, reason is a kind of love of science and evidence-based thinking, as opposed to subjective type thinking. And again, so fascism at very least is going to attack those three things. And that's not to say that everything that attacks those things is fascist, because, Maoist China and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and lots of movements have attacked those things. But at least you're kind of starting to define what fascism is. And then I slightly lost my thread for the moment there, but yeah, so at the very least, so in my book, I looked at what I called left fascism in those ways. So in what I said, look, here's how this movement is attacking equal rights. Here's how this movement is attacking science, and here's how this movement is attacking free speech. Those three things, and actually, this woke movement is attacking all of those three things very concertedly. It's so.
But then fascism was also a very specific thing, which was a political movement as well, and it was a bureaucratic machinery. It wasn't just this, because I mean, that's why I'm reluctant to use the word fascism, because there were romanticism, for instance, is part of, it can be part of fascism. There's a lot of romanticism, but romantic anti-capitalism, for instance, isn't fascist. It's like misguided, backward looking, and so on, but it's not directly fascist, because it's not like a machinery. It's not this, it's not a organized political kind of movement. And I think that's the kind of sticking point.
I think you're right, because especially 5 years ago, you couldn't see a machinery around this. It was absolutely it was a mishmash of academic ideas combined with political movements. Like, Black nationalism has always been a political trend, which has particularly interested me, because I've come across it in my youth and over the years. And being in a mixed marriage, I've been in mixed relationships before. You find you come across Black nationalism in its real form, in terms of hostility towards my family and that kind of thing. So these movements, again, I slightly lost my thread, but yeah, that's certainly, so kind of, you're right, there hasn't been an apparatus, and that's why, again, it's been so hard to talk about this movement. But it's building an apparatus, and so it has brand names now. It has street movements. So things like Black Lives Matter, which has emerged over the last 6 years, so which barely existed when I wrote my book, and is now one of the expressions of the woke movement. And it's also one of the most popular political movements that's existed. But certainly that contains a lot of things that you might call fascist, even though it stands for many different things still, but it contains a strong anti-Semitic streak. It contains basically Black nationalism. The Black Lives Matter has a Black nationalist core, which most people don't understand because they don't necessarily understand the history of Black nationalism, but it's certainly got a very segregationist streak. There's this thing called pro-Blackness, which is basically a new word for Black nationalism, which is always seeing everything through a racial lens and always favouring Black issues over any other issue. And again, things like Me Too have emerged out of the kind of mulch of, there's this kind of protean protozoic. No, what am I talking about? Yeah, this kind of
Proto-fascist? That you're trying to say?
no.
Like,
I was thinking of this. We kind of had this soup of ideas, which is
oh, right,
gradually
yes,
gelling into movements, and
right.
the term I'm thinking of relates to the early life, kind of 4 billion
Mm.
years ago, or whatever. But I've forgotten the term. But we're watching these movements gel.
Primordial soup, I think you meant.
That's
Primordial soup, is that
that's
right?
where I was
Yeah.
going. Yeah. So I
My brain
think
is similarly mushy.
I would have remembered the word. Yeah, I only just made the link, and so it took me a while to retrieve the word. But that's kind of where we were 5 or 10 years ago. This primordial soup of woke ideas, which is gelling and building, um, an apparatus, and the apparatus is becoming quite powerful. The kind of issue of
Well, yeah, and in that sense,
diversity training and
exactly, yeah.
this kind of thing.
It's like building. It's like sort of becoming part of the bureaucracy, even as it's not a gelled, clear political kind of movement with a name, or like that is participating in parliament and that kind of thing. The ideas are kind of like bubbling up, and it's also fascism was a predominantly middle class movement with the backing of big capital. And picked up some people from the working classes and the sort of lumpen proletariat, but for the most part it wasn't a working class movement,
and that's a very important comparison, I think.
Yeah, and that's what pisses me off too.
Yeah,
like people will go, oh, people voted for Hitler, which is totally historically illiterate, but also the fascist movements won very little of the working class. They were always more about the peasantry and the middle classes. They're very romantic about the peasantry, which is another parallel with wokeness too, because woke people feel much more comfortable talking about the peasantry of the third world, or sorry, of the developing world, than they do about working class people. And there's a little bit of revisionism, historical revisionism. Yeah,
much more
seeing
comfortable.
fascism as a working class movement.
I know. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think that's nailed. What probably the most important thing, if you're looking at whether this movement is communist or fascist in nature, it's absolutely. First of all, it kind of separated from the working class. The working class and the left have kind of gradually been divorcing over the last 30, 40 years or so. And then it's turned its back on the working class, and it's found its way to demonize the working class, even while occasionally paying lip service. But one of the things that this work makes this woke movement absolutely much closer to fascism than communism is that it's completely bereft, separated, adrift from the working class, and it's absolutely a middle class movement. And what we've seen as over here, and you might have seen similar in the US, even though I know you live in Swansea, but the way the Labour Party, as it swung left, also has lost all of its working class seats, or a lot of its working class seats, and gained seats in the leafiest parts of West London. That's where that was its surge under Corbyn, was in the wealthiest parts of London.
It's the same thing in Canada. I'm not American, I'm Canadian.
Sorry, I'm
very, that's okay.
Sorry.
It's very similar, and it's a very similar kind of story as well, where you've got these middle classes that are very, very woke, and like my family's poor, and when my mom is like so weird, knee-jerk McCarthyite or something. She's like, hate communists.
Yeah.
And when I actually try to explain what Marxism is about, she's like, oh, that's not communism. And I'm like, yeah, it is actually. That's what we're all about. There's just this complete divide where all of these, it's sad because all of the slanders that were said against Marxism are now actually espoused as like positive qualities. Like, this is the thing that really bugs me, is that it's like, oh, well, communists, my mom or dad would say like, oh, communists want to make us all equally poor. No, the point, if you look at like Sylvia Pankhurst, it's like we don't preach a gospel of thrift. We want more than all the people can consume. James Connolly, our demands are moderate. We only want the earth. That communists are driven by greed because we want it all. I want it all. I don't want to spend my life working for some so that Paris Hilton can go party on a yacht. Like, no, I want the wealth that working people create. I want it all to make a better life, to make us richer. That's the darn point, to give us the freedom that wealth ought to create. And yet you have so many people who are like, oh, well, like I actually saw so-called leftists having an argument about how UBI is a good thing because people consume too much anyway. And I just want to, like, do you talk to normal people?
It's one of the, so the ultra, I call it the gentrification of the left that's taken place. And it's got to such an extreme that the movement is hostile to working class people and talks in language that nobody outside of humanities department would really understand, or not to. Sorry, I'm not attacking your
I'm not in a humanities department. Ironically, I'm in a health department.
But yeah, so I wrote a piece quite a few years ago, an article called "How the Middle Classes Appropriated Oppression," and this whole identity politics thing wasn't just they say, yeah, you know, we're supplementing class politics. We of course we're worried about poverty and the poor, but we also are worried about race, and we're also worried about sexism. But what they actually did was take this concept of oppression, which I've always seen through a mostly economic lens. You know, if you're poor, there's nothing more oppressive than being poor, and pushed the working class out of that structure and replaced it with racism is the worst thing and sexism is the worst thing. But what they actually did was to say, this black person who happens to be the son of a Nigerian prince and a multi-millionaire is now my oppressed person that I'm going to save. So yeah, the way that black nationalism and feminism to a large extent kind of squeezed into the left and pushed out class interests, to me makes it an intensely fascist type movement. And you know, as you say, fascism is one of the key differences between Mussolini's early fascist movement and the socialist movement that he left was differences over class, that he built a movement that was cross-class and actually, as you say, very much based in the middle classes. And to the genuine socialists of that time, that, you know, to the communists, the Marxists of that time, that was completely unacceptable. You know, you can have middle class allies supporting the class struggle, but you absolutely cannot build a socialist movement around the middle classes. And I think it's,
and that's why Mussolini is so instructive. And I feel like everyone should read fascist literature to get a sense of what they actually said. Although a lot of things that they said were like ironic and they didn't really mean what they're saying. But it's interesting because Mussolini his socialism was always very aristocratic, and he was very anti-mass as well. And I think that when you lose both the side of the working class, but also the idea that, like, socialism, communism, Marxism is about empowering the mass of society. There's a very good line, I think it's in Lenin's obituary for Engels, where he says the people of the time looked with horror on the working classes, but Marx and Engels didn't share their pessimism. Their optimism grew as the working class grew. They put all their hopes in the hands of the working class, and the idea was about empowering the mass of society. But fascists were very anti-mass society. That's why they didn't like the word the people. They talked about the folks.
Yeah, and actually,
which is very interesting because you hear people use the word folk all the time, because folk is the mass transformed into something better, something like the nation. You had to. There's a good line, I can't remember who it's from a fascist writer, where he says, left to their own devices, the working classes become too greedy and acquisitive. We will give them higher values for which to fight.
So and these attitudes on the left, as the left has become gentrified, it's kind of understandable that working class people moved away, and you know, living standards are almost nowhere in today's left-wing programs. They want to, you know, it's about attacking abstract structures like white supremacy and patriarchy, and
because wealth and freedom have been bequeathed to the right. So if you, that's, I get called right wing all the time because I talk about wealth and freedom. So
Yeah,
it's like, oh, you're like American flag behind you and some guns in your hand or something like that.
yeah,
But that was actually the point, right? That's what we were fighting for. So when
mm,
you bequeath economy to the right, oh, you know, and all you're about like welfare, and that's why they talk about the poor too, poorer people. So they want to transform people into like into victims, that so that they can be charitable toward them. That's the kind of politics, that's where like economy fits in. It's like, oh, you know,
mm,
you want to have like a safety net, that kind of thing, which is of course important, but is like the be all and the end all of politics is pretty empty. So again, they're sort of like transforming the mass into something like a peasant, you know, like, oh, thank you, that kind
yeah,
of thing with your cap in hand. Um, um, but also they are, they've bequeathed economy. So like the economy is not really on the table. It's all about these sort of, as you say, abstract things. And when you do that, it becomes, politics just becomes about culture. So when we lost political economy, when that became no longer part of our movements, we damned ourselves to fighting a culture war forever.
mm,
Um, because that's all that there is. You know, if economy is like, ooh, leave all that dirty money to the technocrats, well, what's left? You know,
yeah,
reforming people's minds. And
yeah,
that's not exciting. And in fact, that's incredibly annoying,
yeah.
incredibly intrusive.
It's a vicious circle, I think, because the kind of war, you know, the war on ultimately the class war became a war on has become a war on whiteness and patriarchy, and ultimately a lot of that turns back into an attack on the working class. So actually,
Mhm.
when they attack whiteness, they're actually a lot of the time attacking white working class people who don't follow the rules of what it's like to be working class and vote Trump and so on. And a lot of the language of the left has been repurposed. So the word racist in a lot of contexts is actually a way of, like what we used to call chav or prole, or you know, the old attacks, the old slanders against the working class. You know, racist has almost come to mean white working class scumbag, and it's yeah, rather than someone who actually holds racist views.
But it's sad too, because in some ways it actually creates the monster itself. Like,
Mm,
because people are sick and tired of being called racist, you know, it becomes very difficult to actually call out racism. Like, it becomes
it's
very
become
difficult
impossible. Yeah,
to actually build a movement as well that is universal, because we've actually created real divisions where people feel as though they're under attack from people of the of other
yeah.
races.
I
So
mean,
we've
it's
actually created this situation where we've made class solidarity even more difficult. Even though I
yeah,
will say, like, I do recognize like there's a problem. There is, like, this is the thing that bothers me. When you call everything racist, then nothing is racist,
yeah.
you know. So that we do have, like, people say, oh, institutional racism, that word has been so overused that we can now no longer actually do anything about institutional racism, like, because it's
No,
become this thing
because
where it's everything is
it's
institutional
a
racism.
virtue signal, isn't it? The more people you accuse of racism, the better a person you are. And it's, you know, having come from an anti-racism background, and I've got you know, not only that, I've got an adult son who's half Indian. My family's Jewish. My wife's Nigerian. My two younger children are half Nigerian. Most of my friends are from working class West Indian backgrounds. I've marched against racism, whatever, and a few years ago, people would start calling me racist because I stood up against these kind of woke racists as I saw them, and that initially outraged me and shocked me, because to me that's the worst thing you could be called.
Mm.
And it's got to the point where I laugh if someone calls me a racist, because the people who call me racist are usually people with no black social circles at all, who it's almost become a defensive mechanism for the kind of middle English white middle classes to call someone a racist, maybe to before someone attacks them for racism. But yeah, the word is
Yeah, but
utterly devalued.
but it also, like, but like even like institutional racism, is the example that I used, is um not actually, when people talk about it, they mean like lots of people in that institution are racist.
Yeah,
But that's not
which
what
isn't the
institutional
same
racism
thing.
is.
No,
uh,
no.
so it's like, oh, we'll just go in and reform people's subjectivity. So the problem is you. The problem is you people, masses, you're all a bunch of racists. And here I am, benevolent middle class, to reform your subjectivity, which is great. Again, the middle classes with the backing of big capital come in as a front against the working class. But they're also making a place for themselves and making a use for themselves, because fascism also came out of the sort of attack of capital against the middle classes, this sense of precariousness and this fear that they have of getting tossed down into the working classes themselves. And so they create these sort of issues that they then attend to. They make a purpose for themselves by creating the idea of the working class as this like site of all social problems. So institutional racism, redefined as, you know, bad people doing bad things and bad ideas in people's heads, is wonderful, because they can go in and reform their subjectivity, and they've also got a wonderful purpose for themselves. But institutional racism is when you're like, you don't even have to be a racist, but by ticking boxes on forms, you reproduce racist social structures. So like immigration is a very good example of this. As an individual immigration officer, you can be a very nice person, you can go on Black Lives Matter marches, but your job requires that you keep Black and Asian people out. It doesn't matter if you're a nice person. Just by meeting an immigration quota, your job, and ensuring that, well, things are, I don't know how things are going to change now, but ensuring that only white people come in, i.e. people from the EU who were perceived as more likely to be able to integrate. Just by doing that, you don't even have to have bad ideas in your head. That it reproduces racist social structures. Or like the police attacking, like the whole like apparatus of state repression is about this is me pulling Lenin here, but is about keeping the working classes and the poor down, right? It's about maintaining that the class rule, the hegemony of the bourgeoisie.
Maintaining the social structure, and to an extent, the more poverty you have, the stronger a state you need to maintain the structure. But I mean,
and so when you do that, you reproduce class inequality, race inequalities. Those get reproduced, even if you didn't need to.
A good example is Black Lives Matter, which is this weird movement kind of headed by it was started by 3 middle class Black American women. So again, but with a very left-wing, deliberately left-wing program, which is anti-police, and it has, this defund the police or withdraw the police from cities is absolutely core to this program, but the result of withdrawing police from inner cities or from the poorest areas is that the murder rate goes up, and overwhelmingly among poor Black people. And that's actually what's happened this year. And I live in a fairly poor white minority area where the people on the worst estates, which have the most stabbings and stuff, are absolutely short. They want more police on their estates. So again, that's the tension between the kind of the identity left, which has a theoretical anti-police viewpoint, and working class people for whom the police are absolutely, the presence of police is a life or death matter. And a friend of mine got stabbed in the arm about a week ago, and I don't, Lenin on the state. I agree that there's to some extent, but also in a modern liberal society, a lot of policing effort isn't spent protecting property. It's spent stopping poor people stabbing each other or shooting each other. And there's a liberal progressive role for the police, which is utterly ignored by these movements because they're middle class. The main violence is probably the number one thing that plagues working class people to a completely different level than it does middle class people in
I don't know
society.
if it's a liberal progressive role, because it's the result of a structure in society and the relationships of exploitation in society that are very resistant to change, very difficult to change. And so kind of like stopping people from killing each other and eating each other alive within that structure, I guess you could call that progressive.
Sure, but you can't blame the police for it. You can, the police may be in a horrible frontline position, but turning around and blaming the police for the problem doesn't get to the root of the problem.
I mean, I don't have a lot of I don't know, I don't have a huge amount of sympathy, because I guess I'm like, I can't really release myself from seeing the police as a repressive thing, but you can't like say, like, focus on that repressive role without looking at the structure that they exist within. So trying to get rid of the police is totally pointless, because they are dealing with the problems, partially part of their role
well,
is
not
dealing
just
with the
pointless,
problems
but
that come from that structure.
It will not just pointless, but it's going to result in a surge of violence overwhelmingly against poor people, and in the short term. And I guess in the US you have the issue of police shootings. Probably the equivalent in the UK, which has very few police shootings, is the issue of stop and search, and that's one issue where I've kind of swung from one side to the other. So seeing stop and search as an oppressive racist thing, to realizing that actually it stops a lot of people from being stabbed in my neighborhood. And it's one of those areas where you suddenly find yourself as a kind of middle class leftist person telling people about their own lives and telling them that they'd be better off without the police around, and they say, but no, because there's this crazy family 3 doors down whose kids run around with knives and we're all terrified of them. And it's again listening to people's lived experience, as the woke would put it.
Yeah, I mean, another thing to understand is that, like, because of the structures of exploitation in society, wind up with, like, when you target the poor, you wind up targeting poor Black people, because but then the question is, like, why,
disproportionately,
so why do we have a structure of society in which those are the ones that get left out? Is I think one of the sort of progressive questions that wokeness does raise. I mean, their end goal is pretty limited, just having like a more colorful bourgeoisie, as long as they all think the same, that kind of thing. But again, there are problems with the fact that there are somebody at the end of the day is going to get left out, but it tends to be particular groups in society that get discriminated against. Like, there is a role for that. I do recognize that. And I'm not saying that racist people don't exist. They certainly do. But you can't understand larger structures in society by looking at people's brains and building up from there. There's something bigger going on. There's something, there's a whole history as well to where particular groups came from, and the fact that that gets reproduced over time. So you have, like, particularly in the UK, there are some groups that came with the immigrant groups that came from privileged positions where they were in the past, and they tend to carry that privilege with them. I hate this word privilege. I don't mean it in the woke sense. I mean that they are more likely to be able to move up and down the class structure. But that's a pretty sort of limited understanding of what a movement is about, when it's just like, first of all, yeah, you can recognize that some people aren't as oppressed, but to focus on the people who aren't as oppressed and direct all your ire at them as though they are the cause of oppression, I think is incredibly ridiculous, and it's also very divisive.
And it ignores, it's a very privileged position to come from, because it completely ignores, if a person can look at a rich Black person and a poor white person and not be sure which one of those has a worse life, then they must be coming from a position of delusion to an extent. To me, there is no equivalent in modern British society between being Black and being poor. And to an extent, wokeness and intersectionality tries to equate these things in some way, and kind of loses itself along the way. But I mean, certainly the solutions are the solutions of the left, or of the left. The introduction of the National Health Service was an introduction of the National Health Service for everybody, but it obviously it favors but the poor benefited far more from it than the rich. And given that, say, poor people, say ethnic minorities, have worse health problems for a variety of reasons than white people, universal health care is going to be distributed more to ethnic minorities than white people, without you having to specifically segregate and and categorize people and try and direct the healthcare to them.
Well, I think part of the reason why like wokeness has become institutionalized as well is the realization that that's true to a certain extent, but there's also still a class gradient. And so that was one of like the big questions of, well, we have this National Health Service, we have this universal thing, and yet we still have racial inequalities, we still have class inequalities when it comes to health outcomes. So then the question was, well, then it must be something else. And there are all sorts of answers to that. And one of those answers was discrimination.
Yeah.
But there are others as well, like the fact that your life is just like a tiny bit more difficult, sort of over the course of your, being poor, over the course of your life, means that you have like crappier food and your job sucks, and like just all these like different things will accumulate over a lifetime.
A whole bunch of
but
things.
Discrimination may also play a role in that, a small role. But
it could do. It's just, I think, far less of a
but you couldn't explain the whole gradient on the basis of people being assholes.